He was nervous. He was nervous because, as the State Department itself later acknowledged, 90% of Jakarta's military arsenal was supplied by Washington. There was a treaty between Indonesia and the United States, a treaty executed pursuant to U.S. law, which said that those weapons could not be used for offensive purposes. So if Suharto carried through with his general's recommendation and invaded East Timor, he would be breaking U.S. law. He would be violating the terms under which he had been given 90% of his weaponry. And the CIA and the DIA were cabling back to Washington that Suharto was very nervous about any possibility of U.S. dissatisfaction, about any threat of a cut in U.S. aid. Domestically, within the U.S. at this time, there was indeed some popular and congressional pressure to cut aid to Indonesia because Indonesia was an oil-producing state. The U.S. at that time was suffering the economic shock of the oil price increases. Aid to a country like Indonesia was rather unpopular. So Suharto wanted to be absolutely sure that any move he made on East Timor had the full approval of the United States from the highest levels. Throughout the year, he received signals and statements from Washington that the U.S. had no objection to an invasion of East Timor, but Suharto wanted to get the assurances face to face. And on the morning of December 6th, he got them from Ford and Kissinger. 16 hours later, Indonesian troops were coming ashore at Dili Bay. They swept ashore and went through the streets, dragging people out from their homes. By this time, the government of East Timor had retreated to the mountains with what guns they had left over from the Portuguese administration in hopes of mounting a guerrilla resistance. The population of Dili at this point was overwhelmingly civilian. The Indonesian troops dragged them out to the Aria Branca, the white sand beach, and lined them up along the beach, gunning them down with their American machine guns. They brought them down to the harbor, gathered crowds of people at gunpoint, ordered the crowds to count off one by one as the bodies fell. In this manner, they executed Roger East, the wire service reporter, the wife of the Timorese prime minister, the head of the Timorese Women's League, probably thousands of people in all. They wanted to send the message to the Timorese: Indonesia was here. This was the new rule in East Timor. As this was happening, detailed hour-by-hour reports were coming back to the White House and being relayed on to Ford's plane as he was traveling in Asia. The Australian military has a signal station set up in the northwest of Australia, which enabled them to intercept all Indonesian electronic communications. And they were able to give excruciatingly detailed hour-by-hour accounts on Indonesian military planning and strikes and so forth. What began on that day was one of the great massacres, one of the great genocides of the late 20th century. Kissinger and Ford, particularly Kissinger, had urged the Indonesians to get the invasion over with quickly. They were giving permission to violate U.S. law, but Kissinger was afraid that this could become an issue in the U.S. Congress. There's even a transcript of an internal State Department meeting which shows Kissinger berating his subordinates because some of them had put notes on paper regarding the U.S. policy toward Timor. He didn't want any of this to leak. But the theory was that if the Indonesians could get it over with quickly, use sufficiently massive force, they could have Timor before it became an issue in Congress. As it happened, they did not get it over with quickly. To this day, there is fierce resistance by the East Timorese, although at this point, the Timorese are essentially out of weapons. The Indonesian military estimates they have a couple hundred. I think that may be a credible estimate. What happened was that when the Indonesians came in, they found that those with guns resisted them in the hills, and the others, the people in the villages, picked up and left town. They retreated into the mountains rather than waiting in their villages for the entrance of the Indonesian troops. And a full 2 years after the invasion, Indonesia had still not secured control over a majority of the Timorese population. It was at this point, at the end of the Ford and the beginning of the Carter administration, that the United States shipped in planes and helicopters, particularly OV-10 Bronco planes designed for flying low over the trees, enabling them to machine gun and bomb at low altitudes. They used these planes and helicopters to bomb and strafe people out of the hills. The Timorese were brought down and placed in resettlement camps. At one time, fully 1/2 of the national population of East Timor was in prisoner resettlement camps. In this camp, the Indonesian army imposed a policy of forced starvation. They restricted people from going out to farm their fields. They were afraid that if they got out into the fields, they would start talking to each other. They would start plotting against the army. They might make contact with those who are still refugees in the hills. They might make contact with the guerrillas in the hills. There are detailed Indonesian military manuals disclosing these procedures, which are now out, have leaked on the public record. Indonesia had sealed off East Timor to the world, but at months into this policy of forced starvation, a few international relief workers were able to get in. One described it as being worse than Biafra. A few photos have come out from that period showing children with limbs like pencils and the large heads and the distended bellies. As this was going on, the U.S. was continuing to pump military aid into Indonesia. Immediately after the invasion, the U.S. had reacted by doubling military aid to Indonesia. Just as today, the State Department is now calling for a doubling of U.S. military training aid in the wake of the November 12 Dili massacre. What Indonesia did in East Timor was, I think, in a sense, rather unusual in the annals of world repression. I've spent quite a few years covering some of the most repressive regimes on earth, places like El Salvador, Guatemala. These places are truly hell on earth. But I have to say that until I went to East Timor, I had never seen a place where the authorities had succeeded in making so many people quite so terrified. The reason is that the army set about a systematic dismantling of Timorese society. There are no unions in East Timor, no press, no student groups, no professional groups. All have been disbanded, their leadership executed, banned by military fiat. To the extent that the Timorese have a civic life, they conduct it underground. As you walk through Dili and start to talk to the people, you soon notice virtually every block contains a military or police base. Many of the houses which appear to be civilian dwellings are actually military torture and interrogation houses. We met with Governor Carrascolau, asked him about this. I asked the governor, do you know where the torture houses are? He said, of course, everybody knows where the torture houses are. I said, well, have you ever tried to go in one? Because he had been telling us up to that point that he was always trying to restrain the military in their repression against the people. He reacted with incredulousness to the question. He said, go into one of the torture houses? Are you kidding? I'm only the governor of East Timor. What if some lieutenant decides to shoot me? I don't have that kind of authority. This is the highest ranking Timorese authority. As we would walk in August of 1990, coming into Dili, people would approach you on the streets, anyone who was obviously a foreigner. They would sidle up very warily, very nervously, whisper something like, they'll kill us if they see us talking. And then very quickly, in very condensed form, they killed my father, they killed my wife, they killed my cousins. Please take a message to the Secretary General of the United Nations. Please inform the Prime Minister of Australia. Please tell the Congress of the United States. Time after time, place after place, in villages throughout the country, people would approach in this manner when you had a chance to get alone with someone, especially if you could speak to them in Portuguese. It was like people casting a bottle out onto the ocean with the message that they were trapped on an island with those who had just slaughtered a third of their relatives and friends and asking somehow for some kind of international aid. Many of these people had a sincere hope that if only the President of the United States could hear about this, if only the Congress could hear about what was going on, then they would help. That day on November 12th, the banners those people were carrying as they walked from the motel to the cemetery, many of them were pleas of that sort. They said things like, help us, President Bush, asking for help from Portugal, assuming that the U.S. could play a constructive and humane role. The fact